Thanks a lot for having me, and a warm welcome from my side, also from the introduction. Maybe a few words about myself. I'm part of the OSPO, or the Open Source Program Office in Bosch these days, so I have the privilege or the chance to look on open source from a bit more abstract way. So obviously a lot of automotive stuff, but also from other domains. I've been working with Eclipse IoT in the past, but also with the Eclipse SDV, so I was one of the people in the very beginning of the Eclipse SDV working group involved. And from all these different conversations that we had on there, I also had the idea or some feeling that it might make sense to maybe take one step back and talk about, okay, why do we actually do open source and how does it inflict here? Second disclaimer, if this sounds very similar to the previous talk, we actually thought about, okay, how can we combine these things? But the idea was, okay, with the first talk, we talk about more like how is open source done in the Eclipse Foundation. So why are these things in the Eclipse Foundation like they are? While here the intention is to be a bit more generic or broad. I need to start with a disclaimer because this is more personal observation. As you know maybe from some of the ads, this talk is based on personal observations and collected best practices. It is not in any way intended to expose anyone or to claim that there's only one way of doing things in the open. For any further questions, risks or side effects, ask your local OSPO to-do group ambassador or your neighbor in this group. And this is what I also encourage you to have this discussion about some of the pointers that I will get to. So, looking at the automotive industry, and I think this is not unique to automotive, we've seen it in a lot of hardware industries, networking for instance. We started by having really this manual controlled systems, got over to more specialized hardware to really go from the physical to the hardware world. I think what we currently see is a lot of the mixing hard and software, so we have more general purpose hardware but use the software on that. And the goal that at least the people in the SDV working group and also across the industry are aiming for is these software-defined vehicles. So really be software-defined and have an overarching software system here. Getting there and really being on the software side, I've also seen it in other industries, is that we get to a point where open source comes into question or comes into play, that people want to do open source. And my feeling is, especially also in automotive, that we see a lot of people saying, yeah, open source was pretty well. We do open source now as well too, because it proved to be good. Or to put it in other words, what do you think about open source? So people say, yeah, it's cool, or it's just a bunch of nerds in the corner. We will do it seriously afterwards because we are the engineers, so it will never work. But there's also people saying, yeah, you can make billions. Like IBM bought companies like Red Hat or HashiCorp, and it obviously also transforms a lot of industries. So the question is, what is open source actually? It's a bit like everyone is talking about it. We just did a whole talk explaining what open source is. What is it? And here I need some of your engagement because I would like to get a humming or clapping game. So I will tell you a couple of potential answers to the question, what is open source? At least answers that I have heard in the past. And I would like to see whether you agree that this is open source or not. So, first of all, open source is only about the license. Who agrees with that? I can't see you because there's so much light, but I could hear you if you would make a noise. Okay. Interesting. Open source is a working model. See, a bit of nodding, okay. So interesting that this is more agreement for the working model than for the license. Is open source about saving cost? Okay, shaking heads. Serenity? Yeah, one or two hands raised. Funny story, if you listen to, let's say, politicians or high-level managers, I think in the last half year we heard serenity a lot, but the open source term was not used so often in that regard. Is open source a business model? Okay, I hear laughing, okay. Is it a compliance risk? So is it just a problem? Okay, I see a bit of nodding. Innovation? Or is it just marketing? We just do it and then once there's an actual customer, we just redo it in a proper proprietary internal way. Okay. Or is it just for fun? I guess that's why some of the people also are drawn to open source. Point is, and you cannot really say, okay, this is open source, and then the other side has exactly the same meaning for that. I mean, there is the definition by the Open Source Initiative, and personally I always try to get back to that, which is basically saying, yeah, your software needs to be under a particular license, which allows you to have a free distribution, source code available for inspection, and I guess you kind of have seen it already, so license should also not specific to any product or discriminate against specific fields or persons or groups or fields of endeavor. Point is, and that's also why I had the slideshow in the beginning, is obviously this is just a very basic definition. When people talk about open source, it's not so much they only talk about the license, they talk about all the other things that come with that. Maybe another motivation, I think, why automotive and also other industries like to engage also in open source or open collaboration, as you could say it. So a classical model that we've seen was this close development or even close collaboration, and there it might take, you don't see anything from the outside, you wait a year, you don't see anything at all, and after 2 years you see maybe an 80% solution, and then all the other people that have not been involved before were like, yeah, this does not really fit our use case, or we should add this or that. That's maybe the classical proprietary way. In the open way, it's a bit different because you already see results quite in the process. So I think that's also what sometimes is why open source is seen in a bad way. Is in the very beginning, it might seem even worse than doing nothing because it's completely confusing and a lot of different ideas. Because these discussions now happen in the open and not behind closed doors, where you also lose some of the control. However, since you are able to involve more perspectives, more views on that, after 2.5 years, just don't count me on the years here exactly, but after some time you might end up with a better and more proven and used solution compared to the closed development. So how is the state of collaboration in the Eclipse SDV community? And I think that's kind of the same motivator also for the PMC to talk here. I did a small analysis of the project, so I found 31 distinct projects in GitHub. So first disclaimer, I didn't look into the data for the GitLab projects. So some of the projects are hosted in the GitLab instance by the Eclipse Foundation. And these projects, they have around 400 repositories and almost more than 1,000 distinct authors. So these are at least usernames that committed to one of the projects. I cannot claim that these are individual people because I know multiple people that use different accounts, but that's maybe beyond the scope here. However, and I think this is quite striking, only 88 people actually contributed to more than one project. So if we really think about the Eclipse as the working group as a group of people working together, I think there's room for more inter-collaboration. Especially if you look into the first 8 accounts which have the most projects that they contributed to, they're all somehow associated to the Eclipse Foundation. So the infamous OtterDoc, for instance, is like one committer working with a lot of these projects. What I think was even worse, and shout out to the working group, I know they work on that, is in the last 8 weeks, 7 out of these 31 projects didn't have any commits. So it stopped working. And another 7, they had less than 10 commits. So I would also say it's like really gradually fading out potentially. So that's kind of the motivation why I wanted also to have this impulse as a talk, because my feeling is there's often a lot of good intentions or motivations to start the project, but we have the tendency that it will stop because there's also a bit the sustainability or potentially long-term funding or motivation to do these kind of activities missing. So the question is, how do we reach our goals through open source? And it's kind of turning it around. It's not like you do open source because you want to do open source. It's more like I have a goal and I do open source to reach that goal. And this is already where it becomes complicated because you need to pick your driver. Like what actually drives you to do this open collaboration? And just as an example, I think this can be quite diverse in a sense. And depending on your driver, you also have conflicts coming up with people that might have a completely different driver. It can also be aligned. So, for instance, for some people, it's really because they want to volunteer. It's maybe not too much a case in SDV, but in general in the open source ecosystem we see this a lot. People just wanted to do it for the public benefit. But at the same time, you might strive for zero licensing costs. It's really hard business that you follow here, or transparency. And this also gives you another observation about the maturity in an open source project. So thanks to this guide, which is called In Principles of Industrial Open Source. So you see there's already the company perspective in there. There's kind of a ladder or staircase that you follow. So many organizations, they go more for an accidental open source. It's like a boss telling the engineer, hey, come up with a cool solution for that problem. And they are back like instantly because they searched the internet and found someone else who already solved the problem. But it's not really driven, it's more accidental. Can do this in a more repetitive form and then even get to the point of prevailing and really controlling or being a leader or taking a leadership role in that project. The point is, since this is a staircase, I see many organizations that try to do the prevailing and the leadership at the very beginning without building any of these foundations or getting some insights or experience on how to actually work on the, say, lower layers here, which is part of the reasons why things like the PMC and the Eclipse Foundation struggling a bit because they are used to this way of people walking through the ladder or through the staircase, while people like say, hey, I want to jump that, I just want to get to the top. You can put another layer on there because to me there's like two different sides of driving these activities. So one is the engineering driven side. So it's again the engineer having a problem and solving it together with other engineers. And here the thing is you kind of have a hidden return before the invest. So it feels like you get the project for free, but obviously once you depend on the project, you also have to take care of the maintenance, or at least that it is maintained. So this is the invest you have to do afterwards. On the other side, we have the business-driven open source, where people say, okay, yeah, really supports our business case. We are willing to do this invest because it creates a lot of value for us, and we are also happy to maybe share of that, some of that. So here the invest is before the expected return, and this sometimes makes it quite hard to argue for that or to convince people of doing this invest. But once you actually achieve more this business-driven side, it also becomes a bit easier to have it in a sustainable way. So for the business-driven open source, obviously you also need a business model. And I completely subscribe to the notion that open source itself is not the business model. It's more about, okay, how do I set up my business so that contributing to the open source projects or also contributions from others are actually helping that. So we have the classic ones like support and maintenance or packaging, professional services, but it's also more that you own a platform and then work on monetizing out of that platform or do licensing. I won't go too much into details about this due to time and also because I think it's well written out in other places. For instance, and this is the commercial break, and one of the reasons I'm here with you, and let's see who knows German television, because then you're accustomed to that, is there's another activity in the to-do group, which is a combination or loose community of OSPOs, open source program offices, which is exactly looking into the business side of convincing to do open source. But the caveat here is it's not so much about the classical startup or smaller business doing open source and trying to build a business around creating that project. I see a lot of phones, it's nice. It's more about how do larger organizations that are not necessarily relying on software as a core business model approach open source. So you already see one of the main contributors is Cornelius Schumacher from Deutsche Bahn. And this is a really good example because, at least from my perspective, you choose Deutsche Bahn or the railway company in Germany not because they have the best software, but because they provide you a solution to another problem. But they also need a lot of software to do that. Another contributor was Emily Omier so far, who was also one of the founders for the Open Source Founders Summit. So more these startups relying on open source as a core. So I'm really looking for input or ideas here. To put it in another way, when I pitched this idea to colleague from another company, he was like, hey, we all have this small slide deck in our desk or in our drawer to convince management why we want to do open source or why we would need an open source program office. And let's just combine all these slides and see how we find a common argumentation line. And with that, it's already the end of the commercial break. But if you're wondering where these business models and also the drivers came from, it's exactly from that document. Okay. Now, we talked a lot about, okay, there are different drivers. We just had the talk before telling you, hey, you have to do this, you have to do this. But is there only one way to do an open source project? I mean, if I ask the question, obviously not. Again, it depends. Because, and bear with me, it's a bit, I just came up with the idea. If you're into distributed systems or computer engineering, you might come across this CAP theorem, where you say if you want to have a distributed system which has to be consistent, partition tolerant, and should be available, it's really hard to achieve or almost impossible to optimize on all of three of these dimensions. So it's a bit depending on your requirements, whether you need the partition tolerance or the consistency, for instance. I try to adapt this to the open source or open collaboration model. And I would argue, and I'm really looking for your opinions here, is that here the theorem would be you cannot have cohesion and control, a large ecosystem, and pace at the same time. So for the pace, it's more the partition tolerance. So are people or teams able to work independently from each other? For the cohesion or control, it's really a consistent roadmap. So it's like a really completely clear UX journey from an outside perspective. And also, how available are you for contributions and usable artifacts? Another way to look at this, and thanks to the Mozilla Foundation for funding that, is the so-called archetypes. So there are different open source projects, archetypes for how to do these projects. And the reason I'm putting them in here is it's quite relevant to me to actually be aware that there's not the one and only open source project. So people might build a multi-vendor infrastructure, and I think that's also what we're doing in Eclipse SCV mostly, is that you build a common layer on which you can create your own solutions on top of that. So these multi-vendor infrastructures like Kubernetes or OpenStack, they tend to have more like loosely coupled modules that joined together become more or less a de facto standard because a lot of people in the industry use that. And you also have a more formal governance with really formal tech committees, membership-driven, and also more large organization contributing to that. On the contrary to that, we also have the single maintainer house plant. And I think that's also where a lot of frustration comes in, because the single maintainer house plants in curl is just one of the striking examples. There's one or two guys that are really deeply looking into a particular problem, which is then adopted by many people in the industries. And if you now collide these worlds of multi-vendor infrastructure, we have to be this more governance-driven thing compared to a single maintainer who's like just driving their project in a way. You already see there's room for conflict or miscommunication. Or same with specialty libraries. Here, the idea is more we have a really specialized group of people that work together. So FFmpeg or SSL are examples. So it's again used across the industry in a wide form, but at the same time you need a lot of domain know-how or knowledge to actually do meaningful contributions. So these projects might not super urgently looking for new contributors because it takes a lot of time to actually onboard them into the domain, which also gives them other needs compared to, let's say, a trusted vendor like MongoDB or Grafana, which basically have a product and a whole productization strategy and use open source more as a tool to get through the market and still try to maintain a lot of control. So for instance, I would be really surprised to see a trusted vendor project in the Eclipse Foundation, but maybe there are, because putting it in the Eclipse Foundation also gives away some of the control towards the foundation, not in the sense that the foundation is controlling the project, but in the sense that they ensure a fair and governance on the project. So you cannot just say, hey, this guy is becoming a maintainer because I want that. You have these structures that try to really also ensure the community-driven approach. So there are even more archetypes to that. So I think even by the names you can already see there's quite a difference. So one of my favorites is a rocket ship to Mars, which sounds like super crazy. It's like really a few people coming together and having a crazy vision to do that. Often these also evolves and maybe to a wide open project, for instance, or you also have these upstream dependencies that we also talk a lot when it comes about security and supply chains. So these are very small projects no one knows the name of, but they're they're in a lot of other software projects because they do such meaningful things, like logging, for instance. With that out of the way, let's shift a bit the perspective. Because so far it was more an observation of, let's say, the ecosystem or the market. And now let's shift the perspective to, hey, I'm a maintainer. So I want to do a project, I want to collaborate on that, or I have maybe other reasons why I do it in the open. So how do I actually become interesting to contribute to? And this is almost a marketing activity, to be honest. Because I've seen people that put a project out and said, yeah, the community will solve that. You're like, where's the community? Yeah, they will come because they're the open source people. They will solve everything. And obviously this is not the case, and that's part of the reason we have also this talk. First thing is discovery, like really make the project discoverable and make it clear what you do there. I put in stars here, which is one indicator of the relevance for some people, but there's some caveat to it, so people start buying stars so they can get to their venture capital providers and say, hey, my project is successful, I have so many stars. Like, these stars actually coming from somewhere else, but that's just a side story. But is it really actively maintained is also a really good indicator. First impression, so do we really know what it's doing, who is it for, why should I care about this project? How easy is it actually to get started? Because remember the staircase, it starts with the usage. People tend to use the project, tend to find it useful, and then they actually have a larger motivation to also contribute to the maintenance of the project compared to, yeah, I don't even need that. Then also the maintainer perspective, again, really be aware that there's also this journey from, okay, people are using the project, become a contributor, add some contribution, and then end up being a maintainer. It's sometimes forgotten when people say, hey, I have this cool open source project, but no one wants to be a co-maintainer here. I do all the things on my own. And then you ask them, like, how easy is it to contribute? And they're like, yeah, you have to fulfill this, and that rule, and also you have to be a seasoned C++ programmer for the last 20 years. Otherwise, I won't accept your pull request. And you're like, there's maybe a bit where the problem is coming from. How open are you also to support or mentor people in this journey? Maybe some motivators why it also makes sense to be as a maintainer to open that up. So it really opens multiplies the workforce here, gives you more the long-term investment. So classical motivations also for doing mentorship. And so one resource that I really recommend to you is a book called Social Architecture by Peter Hintjens. He was a maintainer of one of a large project which had a lot of contributions, ZeroMQ. Yeah, he was also involved there, or did. Yeah, ZeroMQ. That's what at least that's where I know him mostly from. And he postulated, or not postulated, but had this nice way of giving you some hints on how to act or react if you maintain such a project. And this is a disclaimer if you're interested in growing a community. Because again, if your driver is different, you might not need a community, but in most cases, this helps to reach your goals. One thing is you really should get your fundamentals right. So have a strong mission, and really, why does this group exist? And what he also says, and I strongly subscribe to that, is this mission should be based on positivity. It's so driven by positive goals in the sense, if you ask someone why you are in that community, it should be because I want to achieve this and that, and not because the people on the other side are bad. I don't want to talk to them, or because I want to have something bad for the other side. It's really more the positive goals here. It sounds quite of obvious, but at the same time, I think in business we are kind of used to having it's us against them thinking at some point, which might get in the way if you want to really collaborate in the open. The other thing is participation. So how easy is it actually to join and to get started with the whole process, to actually have a smooth learning? So that's why people tend to say you need documentation, because obviously this enables you smooth learning. And remember, people use, contribute, and then maybe become a maintainer. If it's impossible to use your product because no one knows how to do that, difficult story to actually grow it. Another thing, and that might be a bit controversial from a commercial standpoint, is free contributors. What he's saying is it's way worse to have a person who is out of their own motivation, or maybe the motivation of their employer, to put it more on the commercial side, is contributing to the project, compared to, hey, I just pay this guy or this lady to contribute now. And because the moment this money is gone, also the person working on that is gone. So with free contributors that actually have their own way of being motivated, you also have higher engagement here. Another thing is governance. So especially when projects grow, you see a lot of problems which come because there's not these strong protocols in place. It's like people like, hey, we always talk to each other in a closed room, and then at some point people come or add there or are added to the group, and then problems might occur here. But at the same time, you also need a fair authority. It's not about, hey, we have this big law or this rules, you should follow that, and now we kick you out because you made a small mistake and you misinterpreted the second paragraph here. I mean, again, it should be driven about positivity. Also, regular structures. So how predictable is the overall project? How predictable is it actually to find your resources? And transparency. So if you're wondering why the Eclipse project handbook exists, or why it is written that way, I would say it's mostly to ensure this governance, to ensure that there's a fair authority, to ensure that there are strong protocols that you can point to in case of conflict or different opinions. But also, I think what the Eclipse Foundation is doing in a way is this regular structure. So you have these project pages where you get an overview who is involved, you get an idea where the repositories are. The repositories are organized in similar ways. So if you know one of the projects, you have an easy time to find your way around also the other projects. Talking about regular structures. Another point is the autonomy, like how autonomous can the members of your community work together? So is it really a self-organization, or do you need like a dictator telling everyone, you do that, you do that, you do that, which does not really scale. So that's why we have this self-organization, also these free workspaces. So how easy is it maybe to create a sub-project in your project, and how easy is it actually to branch out and combine things? And this brings me to, I think, a very important topic, which is sometimes seems easy on paper, but it's really hard in reality, is this full remixability. Because I think one of the caveats or the benefits of open source is actually you build something and you have a particular use case in mind, and then someone else is building something else, and out of coincidence, the piece of software that you've written exactly matches their use case, even though they're doing something completely different. So I expect that some of the stuff that is done in the Eclipse SDV working group or in the automotive domain will be applicable to other domains as well, but we're not even fully aware yet because we're not so deep in that domains. Think about robotics, think about trains, think about ships, airplanes. And structuring the project in a way that it becomes remixable in somewhere else, like having the software architected in a way that you can actually use this without having the whole stack for which the project was initially built, like with common APIs, for instance, can be very helpful also for adoption or growing beyond your initial scope. Another thing which is also easy to put on slides, but it really needs to be lived, is the culture. So how easy does a group embrace conflict? So conflict can happen, but it should not be a problem that you just split because there's a quick conflict. Obviously, forking is always an option, but at the same time, if you cannot embrace this conflict, you might have a problem. And also to have this measurable success and high scoring, so really reward the participation of people joining the project, because often they might have their own motivations, but also rewarding them in some way is helpful compared to saying, hey, I expect that you do this contribution now. And this is also a two-way street where I think a lot of people can learn in the sense that it's also rewarding the contributors that they did this contribution. It's not like, okay, now please do that and that and that, even though they do it maybe in their free time or because they have other motivations where your requirements do not match there. So it's also part of this high scoring. Last but not least, we have this sane funding, which I thought also particularly interesting in this regard, is make sure that the project is maybe not overfunded, because then people are more there for the money and not because they're so much interested in the project. But at the same time, if it's not enough money in the project or not enough funding, you also starve out the people and get into also emotional problems. With that, I'm looking forward to your questions or opinions. And again, as I said before, if this is somehow interesting to you and also to have this conversation, it's okay, how does open source play in beyond directly connected business models? I happily invite you to continue the conversation around this business guide. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. So, any questions from the audience? Some hands raised.
Comments.
Thank you for your talk. What I would like to add is some kind of comment for the funding, because I think if you have a new project or a newer project that you want to grow the community, for example, you are on GitHub, and we have that for a project which is not in the Eclipse Foundation, we give out some GitHub sponsorship. For example, for the best committer once a month, like $50 or something, nothing big, but this is something that I have the feeling is really working well, because from time to time you can more or less give an incentive to the most active members to continue contributing to your project, no matter where they sit. And you get an invoice and everything is fine for your business.
Yeah. Thanks, completely agreed. I mean, this is, I guess, is somewhere between sane funding and high scoring, because, I mean, it already shows you also some appreciation and rewarding, even though it's obvious that maybe in that case you cannot cover the full cost of that person, but still you show the appreciation there.
Other questions? So if not, then I have maybe one. You have talked about these business models. So we had a lot of discussions in this SDV research project area, how to contribute especially to this S-core. So because we have, at the past, we have the value chains where you have, let's say, tiers, software vendors, and they developed, let's say, this classical AutoSAR stacks, and they sell and resell it year after year, so with the hardware and software on top. Now, if there is this, let's say, open source solution for this middleware, so which is non-competing or competing, so that depends on which you talk. But if I look at that, so is there a business model your company sees, because you are one of the main contributors, because some companies are struggling to say, if we contribute now to this S-core, so maybe then the feature is in, so we get paid for that, maintenance fees maybe for this feature, but before that, so we have developed this whole stack in our company, and what's with the other things now? Is there some business model or business case you can derive for that, so which fits for this whole value chain, or does this open source mean so that the cake pieces of cakes are going smaller, let's say?
I would like to avoid to comment on a particular project, so in this case S-core. What I can say, I think, in general is, even though you might have the same work on the same open source projects, you might have completely different drivers here and different motivators. So many of these, if you also look into these business models, many of these models are driven by the fact that people somehow use your software with knowing or without knowing that. So you kind of did this pre-invest of having the technology openly available, and then build services or additional things on top of that. So integrating your project in another project might also be seen as a way to get the exposure or the adoption of that of your project in this larger context, and then create one of these models there. It really depends on the particular situation of your project and also the project that you contribute to. So maybe another example is what we've seen quite a lot in the CNCF, I would say, is you have this basic platform with Kubernetes, and you have a lot of smaller businesses that somehow strive on the fact that they're quite easy to integrate with Kubernetes. So if you adopter now has Kubernetes, they know, okay, I can use that and that and that software, and might also be willing to pay for some of these softwares because I already know it's quite working very well with this open source stack, which I already rely on. And then you get in this field of, you can do support and maintenance, you can have professional services around that. You might also end up in a situation where other things that you provide, like tooling or completely integration, becomes easier to adopt because the people do not have to work completely with your problem or with your solution. So that's a very abstract way, I know, but that's what I would like to comment on that. So it's really, okay, how do you shape the ecosystem and position yourself so that, you become relevant, if you will.
Okay, thank you. One more question.
Hi. Eclipse is not the first open source project in the automotive world. There have been some before, right?
Yeah.
Most of them that I know actually failed or were not that successful, or some of them. Have you been involved in one of those that were not so successful? And what are your 3 key learnings mapped to the values that you presented that we don't repeat it with Eclipse fund, SDV? Or SCore?
Let me start it differently. So I think the main question is, what is success for an open source project?
Yeah, fair point.
Because I think that's where automotive also has is a bit special in the sense that not all of these principles might not apply directly, in the sense that if your project is used by 2 OEMs, technically you have 2 adopters. But this is a huge success for the project. While if you develop, it's a bad example, a login library, if you only have 2 adopters, it's maybe not a big success. So if your model is really about growing the whole ecosystem, then that's a different story than being driven by one of the adopters. Key takeaways. Let me put it the other way. I was also involved in IoT business. There we built an IoT backend, and I would say, this is just my personal opinion. Forget about the logo in the corner. Is again, how easy is it actually to use that software? Like maybe where does it fit? So these smooth learning and also ease of joining is. If you need a whole data center to set up your solution or need a full vehicle, it's really hard for people to actually play around with this technology. One problem that we also had with in automotive is the tendency that people have a whole stack or a whole internal stack in their mind, and then they feel like, this small piece, I want to collaborate on that. And then they pick out this piece, and the rest of the world or the outside world is like, what is this doing? Like, where should I put it? What is up? What is down? Like, how do I turn it around? because they're missing the whole context of the internal system. But for obvious reasons, the internal system is not public, so it's really hard to map that. And that's also why these to me it feels sometimes more like a picnic. So people just bring something, and then the task is how do we make a meal out of that. If that is the ambition, then it's a really hard task. If it's more about, okay, we agree that this is a particular problem for us, and we kind of are willing to shape our internal stack so that it matches there, then it could be a learning. Maybe one example, a project that we are involved in is Eclipse Cuxel. It's an abstraction layer for automotive. So basically the idea is to decouple all the applications from the internal data or the CAN stacks in the vehicles. And honestly, coming up with such a data model is not a super hard task, but what the problem is to actually agree on this data model and adopt it. And there's this tendency also maybe a bit in this tribalism, if you really want to say it in a bad way, that okay, we already have this solution, we already have this data model, it's hard for us to adopt, and this adoption to actually move a bit to a common solution is maybe another learning, because otherwise it will be hard for people to maintain that.
Thank you very much. Further questions? If not, then thank you again, Sven.
Mm-hmm.